Ever had that feeling like life is slipping through your fingers and all you're doing is watching? I guess you could say that's where I am right now, drifting through each day like a ghost. I'm Evan Marsh, age 36 years, an investigative journalist in the heart of the city. I get along all right in life on paper, at least a job, an apartment overlooking the skyline, and routine enough to plod me through each day. But that's my problem, right? I'm just not getting through. Somewhere along the way, the excitement faded. I lace up my sneakers, hit the pavement, and begin to jog through the concrete maze. It is the one thing that has remained constant, the ritual I can control. In this city, routines are everything. They are the only way to keep up with the grind, to survive the noise, the pace. Yet, deep inside, I feel like something is lacking, like I have been waiting for a story big enough to shake things up. That morning was like any other. At the midpoint of my jog, dodging slow walkers and bustling coffee shops, my phone started buzzing in my pocket. It was Danny, my editor. He never calls during the morning routine, so I pedaled slowly before checking the screen. I vacillated for a moment. He'd only call if it was urgent. "Evan," Danny's voice cracked on the other end, "got a job for you. This one's a little weird." My curiosity perked up. Weird isn't usually my beat. I'm the guy they send to investigate corruption, fraud, maybe an unsolved crime or two. But weird? Not so much. What kind of weird? I asked, wiping sweat from my brow. Danny paused a second, his mind racing, it seemed, for how to sell it to me. "You heard about that old high-rise downtown? The one near the river? Been there since the 40s. People say it's haunted or something." "Haunted? Come on, Danny, you know I'm not one for ghost stories." I chuckled, but part of me was intrigued. "Look, just listen to me," he pressed. "There have been so many murmurs about weird stuff going on there. People are reporting seeing things, and some even claim that at 3:15 every morning they witness a girl on the balcony of the 23rd floor. And she jumps." Hair prickled up the back of my neck. "And then what?" I asked, not certain I wanted an answer. "She's back the next night. Same balcony. Same jump." I gazed out over the cityscape, the rhythmic hum of the street below fading into the background as the idea was ridiculous, but at that moment, I felt a pull, some weird urge to see it for myself. "All right, I'll check it out," I heard myself say. Danny's voice brightened. "Good. I knew you'd bite. This place, people have been talking about it for years, but no one's ever gotten the full story. It might be something, might be nothing, but it's yours if you want it." By the time I hung up, my pulse was racing, and it had nothing to do with the jog. I didn't know what to expect, but was curious, and maybe that was enough. A part of me knew I'd regret it if I didn't at least see what this was about. The rest of my run seemed so short compared with the day before. My mind was jam-packed with questions as I worked my way back up to my apartment. Who was that girl? Why did she jump, and how could she still be there the next night? Rationally, it sounded like utter nonsense, but something in Danny's tone suggested there might be more to this story. I was dressed and headed out the door by mid-morning, notes in my bag, toward that old high-rise. The building was indistinguishable from those surrounding it, brick-aged to a soft red, narrow balconies, a dim lobby with flickering lights. Yet there, standing outside of it, staring up at the rows of windows, this tightness had formed in my chest, as if the building was staring back. Inside, I was greeted by the building's caretaker, a wiry man in his 70s named Max. His eyes were sharp, calculating, but he moved slowly, almost hesitantly, as if every step through the building brought him closer to something he'd rather not face. "Journalist, huh?" he muttered, giving me a once-over. "Come to write about the ghost stories, have you?" I shrugged. "I've heard some things. Thought I'd see for myself." Max snorted. "Be careful what you look for in this place. Some folks say it's best to leave well enough alone. Meaning? His gaze drifted to the 23rd floor, and his mouth tightened. Meaning there's things in this building that go beyond what most people can explain. If I were you, I'd keep my distance from that balcony around 3 a.m. But maybe that's just an old man's warning. Something in his tone made me understand that he wasn't being melodramatic. I thanked him and started up the staircase. With every step, the air got heavier. The walls seemed to close in on me as I went upwards, as if the building itself had secrets it wasn't ready to share. As I came to the 23rd floor, the hallway was quiet, almost dead. I walked over to the infamous balcony, the one in which the girl was supposed to appear. Leaning against the railing, I looked out over the city, trying to work out what could bring someone here night after night only to throw themselves into the void. But as I stood there, a strange sensation crept over me, something cold and unwelcome. The noise of the city faded, and for a split second, I could have sworn that I faintly heard some sort of whisper, very soft, almost like someone's voice was caught within the walls. I spun around quickly, my heart racing, but the hallway was empty. Whatever I had felt was gone, leaving only silence. The rest of the day, I felt as though something was watching me, lurking just out of sight. It was an itch I couldn't scratch, this nagging sense of unease that followed me even after I left the building. That night, lying in bed, that balcony harassed my mind. Who was she, and why did she always come back? For the first time in a very long period, I felt alive. There was something that drove me, other than routine. And as I slid into sleep, one thought lingered in my head: I had to know the truth. Some stories wrap themselves around you, pulling you in deeper the harder you try to look away. This one was starting to feel like that. This feeling from visiting the high-rise lingered on through the next day. The sun streaming through my windows, casting a comforting warmth over my apartment, could not dispel the something dark lurking at the edges of my mind. I tasted bitterness in my coffee. My apartment felt small, every sound outside my door too loud, too close. I was heading back toward the building by early afternoon. I told myself it was just to get a few more facts, maybe talk to a couple of tenants, but deep down, I knew I wanted another look at that balcony. As I stepped into the lobby, Max the caretaker was in his usual position behind the desk. He looked at me with that same wary expression in his eyes, flickering briefly to the elevator. "Didn't think you'd come back so soon," he muttered, shaking his head. "Guess the place has that effect," I replied with a misguided attempt to sound light. Max leaned forward, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Watch out, here. This building, it's not like the rest of them. It's been here longer than most people can recall. And those that dig too deep." His voice trailed off, eyes darting once more to the 23rd floor. "Just watch out," he finished. I nodded to him, more curious than ever. I promptly dismissed the chill that Max's words had left and turned to step into the elevator waiting for me, jabbing the button to the 23rd floor. The ride up in the elevator was silence except for the quiet whir of machinery. I speculated on who lived here, why they stayed, what stories they hauled with them. More important, really, why they seemed so very reluctant to speak of the girl on the balcony. It hissed softly open onto a hallway, heavy with the feeling of weight, like walking into water. The lighting was dim, and long shadows stretched across the faded wallpaper hinting at years of neglect. I could hear murmurs from the apartment's light, normal sounds of lives being lived behind closed doors. After some tentative knocks, I was able to get one door open. A middle-aged woman with tired eyes and nervous energy peered out, studying me with guarded suspicion. "Are you one of those reporters?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Sort of. I'm just interested in the stories about this place," I said, keeping my tone casual. "Have you seen anything strange here?" Her gaze flicked past me, down the hall, and back to the safety of her door. "You should talk to the others," she whispered, her voice barely audible over her breathing. "Some things here are best left alone." I thanked her. I knew by the tone of her voice that she was holding something back, concealing herself behind that fragile shield of indifference. I heard another door creak as I went down the corridor. A voice called out, "Hey, you want to know about the girl?" I turned to find an older man standing just inside his doorway, lined with wrinkles and memories. He beckoned me closer with a wave, glancing up and down the hall as if being sure we were not being overheard. "They say she's been here since before I moved in," he began in a gravely voice. "Every night, she appears on that balcony. And every night, well, you know the rest. And she's real? Not some illusion or trick?" The man chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Real enough that I don't open my blinds at night. No one does, not if they've got any sense. You might not see her right away, but sooner or later, everyone does." "Why doesn't anybody leave?" I asked, genuinely perplexed. He shrugged. "This place has a way of holding on to people. Folks come and go, but some of us, we're stuck here. Maybe it's just too late for us to start somewhere new." He nodded again and vanished into his apartment's interior, the door closing with a finality behind him. I turned toward the balcony, his words on replay in my head. There was something here that had their hooks in people, and they were bound by something they didn't understand. Standing near that famous balcony, the silence seemed to collapse and push against my chest. The city spilled out beyond the railings, sprawling and uncaring, but at that instant, all that mattered was the balcony itself and the heavy, almost palpable presence that would appear to hang on it. Then I heard it. The soft whisper, wafting in from somewhere beyond my sight, right on the edge of perception. Soft enough for me to almost persuade myself I'd imagined it. Almost. "Why are you here?" It was little more than a sigh, but it sent a thrill of fear running through me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my ears, but I was utterly alone in the hallway. There was only the balcony, empty and silent, waiting. I stepped closer, half expecting anything to happen. The air grew colder, the city's noise receding, and for one dizzying instant, I almost felt as if I'd been somewhere else altogether. Somewhere dark, and still, and very, very ancient. Then, behind me, a door creaked open and snapped me out of it. I turned to see Max standing there, his face drawn and serious. "It's time for you to leave," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "Max, have you ever—" "Leave," he repeated, his eyes narrowing. "It's not safe for you here. Come back if you have to, but don't stay after dark." His urgency sliced through tension, and I found myself nodding, moving away from the balcony with the tingle of dread remaining. As I stepped out of the building, I felt like a part of me was left inside, attached to the shadows in that darkened hallway. I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling while my mind whirled with questions. Whispers, girl, buildings seeming to move around me. It all felt unreal yet impossible to deny. And just how much Max's warning had unsettled me, well, one thing was for certain. I was going back. I think part of me knew I was in too deep, but there's just a point when you're so wrapped up in something that turning back just isn't an option. The next morning, even from miles away, I could not shake the feeling that somehow the building had still been watching me. My apartment felt more diminutive, somehow quieter, the air hung heavy around me, it seemed. I thought that a good night's sleep would have cleared my head, but I'd spent most of the night awake, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. Max's words echoed in my mind, his warning hung over me like a threat. I spent the morning buried in research, digging into every old record I could find about the building. The high-rise had stood in the city's shadowed heart since the 1940s, built over an older structure, an abandoned monastery, of all things. There were few official records of the monastery's demolition, but local legends hinted at dark rumors, disappearances, strange rituals, and stories of a young girl who'd never left the grounds. Was she the same girl who appeared on this balcony every night? It was with that thought jammed at the back of my mind that I returned to the building once more, this time determined to talk more with tenants, maybe pry a few more details from Max. There had to be something more to this story, something buried in whispers and shadows. The lobby was deserted when I entered the building, the only sound came from the echoes of my footfalls. It felt different today, darker, somehow. Above, the fluorescent lights hummed weakly, casting the place in uneven shadows. As I stepped into the elevator, I immediately noticed the faint scent of something, burnt wood, perhaps, or incense. The kind of smell you associate with an old church, still lingering long after the smoke has vanished. The doors slid open onto the 23rd floor, and for a moment, I stood there, letting the silence wash over me. There was something unsettling about that hallway, the faded wallpaper, the worn carpet, the sense of a place that had seen too many lives come and go. I could almost feel the weight of those lives pressing down on me. I decided just to try a few doors, hoping someone might be willing to talk. After a few minutes, one young man opened his door, regarding me with equal parts suspicion and curiosity. "You hear about her?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I said, leaning in, trying to keep my tone casual. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" He hesitated, peering down the hall, then nodded and stepped aside to let me in. His apartment was small, cluttered with books and papers, but tidy. He closed the door behind us and waved at a chair. "I don't like talking about it," he began, rubbing his hands together as though to warm them. "But, I saw her once. Thought I was imagining things at first, but then I saw her again. Same place, same time." "When was this?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "A few months back. I was coming home late, about 3 in the morning. Just as I stepped out of the elevator, I saw her on the balcony." He swallowed, his eyes darting toward the window. "She was just standing there, looking down. Then she jumped. I ran over, but by the time I got there, she was gone." "Did you look over the edge?" "Yeah, I did. Nothing was there. No body, no sign she'd ever been there. Just quiet." He fell silent, and we sat a moment amidst the stillness of his words settling heavily in around us. "Why do you stay here?" I asked, finally, the insistent question betraying my incredulity at anyone putting up with this. He stared at me, a resigned look on his face. "Where else would I go? It's affordable, close to work. And, part of me thinks she's just lost. Like she's trying to find her way out of here. I keep thinking, maybe if I understand her story, maybe she'll leave me alone." A coldness ran down my spine. I knew this feeling. This story, this mystery, already it had begun its work of digging its hooks into me, deeper with each new detail. I left his apartment, started back down the hall. My footsteps were really loud. The silence was thick and pressing in around me, and for one fast and terrifying second, I swear I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of something just beyond the edges of my vision. But when I turned, the hallway was empty. I stepped out onto the balcony, into the cool afternoon air. The city sprawled out below, block after block, street after street, an indifferent and endless sea into which people got swallowed up. It was hard to imagine that anyone could step off this ledge willingly, but the image of the girl, quiet and still at 3:15 a.m., sent a chill down my spine that I couldn't explain. I had been so lost in my reverie that I hadn't heard the door open behind me until it was almost too late. "You shouldn't be out here," Max's voice growled, his words sharp and urgent. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, a grim look on his face. He was different now, older, wearier, as if the building itself had worn him down. "What do you know about her?" I asked, brushing off his warning. Max's jaw clenched. "Too much," he growled, looking back over his shoulder as though he feared someone was listening in. "You're not the first to come looking, you know. Others have tried finding out who she is, why she's here. But no one ever gets any answers. Then why does she keep coming back?" He shook his head, gazed down at the city below. "This place, it's not like other buildings. Something happened here, something that left a mark. Maybe she's just part of that. But let me give you some advice, kid, leave this story alone. There are things here that don't want to be understood. Saying that, he turned and walked away, leaving me to myself out in the balcony, his words hanging in the air as a warning. Replaying in my head the conversations, later that night back in my apartment, the fragments of the story began to fall into place. The girl, the balcony, the whispers. It was all connected somehow. And that building, it felt alive, as if it was breathing, watching, waiting. I was more drawn to it now than ever, even as every instinct told me to walk away. A part of me knew I should listen to Max, to the tenants who'd warned me, but I couldn't. There was something in that building calling to me, pulling me back, and I knew there was no turning away from it now. Lying in bed, with the hum of the city through the walls, one vagabond thought fluttered across my mind and chilled me to the bone. I wasn't done with the building. And it wasn't done with me. The next time I came back to the building, I had a plan in place: talk to more tenants, gather facts, and see if I could piece together more of the puzzle. But that plan was quickly unraveling the moment I stepped through the front doors. The lobby was as dark and quiet as ever, and of Max, there was no sign. I headed directly for the 23rd floor, where that strange, unshakable chill had gotten hold of me last time. The elevator doors opened, and the instant I stepped out, something felt off. The air was colder, sharper. I could have sworn I smelled that faint burnt scent again, almost as if it were oozing from the walls themselves. As I walked down the hall, I knocked on a few doors. The response was scarce. Most people didn't open up, while those who did looked at me suspiciously or hurried me away with dismissive answers. Their eyes, however, always said something else: fear, or perhaps just exhaustion. I could tell they didn't want me there. Or maybe they didn't want anyone prying. That night strange happenings of my own began, back home. I threw my keys onto the kitchen counter, as I usually did, and busied myself with the evening routine. Then when I returned from the bedroom, they weren't there anymore. First, I thought I must have misplaced them. I checked my coat pocket, retraced my steps, even scoured the living room, but they were nowhere to be found. About the time I was starting to get a little bit spooked, I saw them sitting right on my bedside table, right where I'd never put them. I laughed it off, thinking this was due to tiredness or a slip-up in memory. That night, my dreams were like unsettling pictures: dark hallways, the smell of something burnt in the air, and that vague, shadowy outline of a figure standing motionless out on the balcony in the cold night air. I woke up with a sudden jolt, startled, heart racing. My alarm clock read 3:15 a.m. I tried to brush that off the following day as some kind of one-time oddity, the product of an overactive imagination. But more and more these little incidents began piling up, my apartment beginning to feel less a sanctuary and more an extension of the building, as if whatever was in that place had followed me home. I sat in my room, late one night, putting away my laptop after hours of researching, and suddenly heard from the kitchen a faint scratching noise. I froze and listened for a beat, trying to convince my mind that it was just a branch scratching against the window. The noise continued, a faint, deliberate dragging, as if something metallic had been dragged across the counter. Yet when I had mustered the guts to check, nothing was wrong. Yet I can swear a whiff of burned wood still hung in the air. I clung to my determination to anchor myself. I turned my attention, at this point, to research. Over the next several days, I raked through public records, newspaper archives, any source that might reveal to me more about the high-rise. Fragments of a story began to surface, though fragmented, full of gaps and dead ends. It had been built over the ruins of a monastery, which, for mysterious reasons, had burned to the ground in the late 1800s. A rumor persisted that one of the girls from the monastery had engaged in some sort of tabooed activity, though for what, exactly, was anyone's guess. Some said it was a ritual, others whispered of a pact gone sour. Regardless, it seemed she'd died in the fire, and locals claimed her spirit had never left. Not much, but enough to get me hooked. I knew there was more to this, something just beyond reach, and my every fiber wanted to find it. One evening, while getting ready for another night up on that high rise, my phone beeped due to a text from an unknown number. It read, "Don't go back. It's not safe. Some things aren't meant to be disturbed." I stared at the note, feeling my heart start to pound. One of the tenants? Max? Or someone else entirely? Despite the warning, or perhaps because of it, I could not resist. I was drawn back to the building, more convinced than ever that I was standing at an edge of something. Maybe not a story, perhaps, in the classic sense, maybe not even something I could describe, just something, and I needed to see it through. When I finally arrived at the building that night, Max was pacing the lobby, looking drawn and serious. "You got my message?" he asked. The tension in his voice took me aback. "That was you?" I exclaimed in surprise. Max sighed. "Look, kid, I've been here long enough to know when someone's in too deep. You're not the first to come poking around, but you can still walk away." "I won't leave now," I said, surprised by the conviction in my own tone. "I have to know what is going on here." He glared at me, his eyes hardening to stone. "Curiosity kills, they say, but if that's so, this place is where it goes to feed. It isn't just haunted, it remembers. It holds on to things. People. Memories. And once it has you, it doesn't let you go." A cold chill crept over me, but I refused to back down. Whatever was going on here, whatever truth lay hidden between these concrete walls, I had to find out. "Then, tell me what you know," I said, my tone firm. Max stared at me for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "There was a girl. Some say she was into things best left unmentioned, things that drew attention. The fire consumed everything, but she remained inside, confined. And the building? Well, it became her cage. Or her realm, if you will." I tried absorbing his words, but they spawned more questions than what they answered. "Why does she show up every night? Why? 3:15? He hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe she's waiting. Or maybe it's just what happens when a soul is trapped between worlds. She keeps repeating that final moment, over and over, and anyone who watches, anyone who's drawn to it, they become part of it. Just like you." The weight of his words settled over me, and for the first time, I felt a sliver of doubt. But by then it was too late. In too deep, turning my back on them now was not an option. And when I finally did get back to my apartment that night, I turned on every light, hoping the fear would dissipate. But upon entering my bedroom, I felt something strange. There, on my bedside table, sat an object that I hadn't seen in years, a metal charm my grandmother had given me as a kid and which I'd lost long ago. I picked it up, feeling this weird mix of nostalgia and unease. How had it gotten here? And more importantly, why? As I lay down, the charm clutched tightly in my hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something that had come to stay. I was more determined than ever the next day. Max's warnings and the strange happenings did nothing to daunt me, rather, they whetted my curiosity. Whatever it was that kept her here, whatever held her tethered to that balcony at 3:15 every night, had to be found out. And I needed to know if I'd crossed the line, if I, too, now were a part of the story of the building, in its shadows in ways that are not totally clear to me. One night later, I was back at the high rise for one reason and one reason alone, to stand out on that balcony at 3:15 a.m. Suffice it to say, I'd read enough ghost stories to figure out once you start pulling the threads on a place like this, it doesn't stop. I had to see her. I had to know if what everyone said was true. The building was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Max wasn't standing at his post in the lobby, and the normal sounds of life inside, creaks, whispers, footsteps, were absent. It was like I stepped into a vacuum, a place unscratched by time and the outside world. The elevator doors opened onto the 23rd floor, and I got slapped with a cold draft, that now familiar acrid smell of burn hanging in the air. It's thicker tonight, like the air in a place long abandoned. I walked down the hall, each step slow, calculated. I half expected someone to stop me, to pull me back, but the building was silent. Finally, I reached the balcony, stepped out, leaned against the railing, and looked out over sleeping city. It felt just weirdly surreal standing out there waiting for the clock to tick closer to that fateful minute. The minutes dragged themselves along, and around 3:15, an eerie silence overwhelmed all. I could feel myself holding my breath, my pulse quickening as I clung to the railing and strained my eyes in the dark. Then, at precisely 3:15, I saw her. She was standing at the far end of the balcony, barely discernible because of the shadows. A small figure, weary, wrapped in something like an old and tattered robe. She flickered in and out of focus, like a projection that threatened to collapse at any moment, no longer able to sustain itself. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring out at the city below, and a cold dread washed over me as I realized I was holding my breath. It was as if I was intruding, like I was seeing something I shouldn't be. Then, without warning, she turned her head. I could not see her face in the dark, but I felt her eyes upon me, a steady, stabbing gaze, cutting through the night. And I could not move, would not look away. Slowly, she raised her hand, as if reaching out to me. I don't know why, but I felt like I had to reach back. My hand moved of its own accord, reaching out toward her into the cold night air. And then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she was gone. The air around me felt emptier, colder. I let out a shaky breath, my hand still hovering in the space where she'd been. I recoiled from the balcony, my heart racing, questions heaving in my mind. What did she want? Why would she reach out to me? And more troublingly, had I just become part of her ritual? I called them as I started back down through the dark, silent hallway. Something was different now. The building felt more perceptive, somehow, as if it had picked up on my presence. Deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning of what I had seen, experienced. I repeated the events of the night over and over in my head, back at my apartment, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Her face, or the shadow where her face should have been, was seared into my memory, haunting the edges of my thoughts no matter how hard I tried to shake it. Over the next few days, bizarre happenings in my apartment worsened. The lights would flicker for no good reason, things that had a place would show up in places I hadn't leave them, and most importantly, that unmistakable smell of burnt just clung to my clothes, furniture, and simply didn't fade. Every time I turned a corner, it seemed as though someone had just been there, slipping out of sight at the moment I moved. Wasn't the building just creeping into my life? Perhaps its shadows extending over and beyond those walls, pulling me deeper with each step into whatever mystery surrounded it? And then one morning, after another restless night, I found a message slipped under my door. It was written roughly, in great haste, the letters barely legible. The words read, "She knows you're watching. Stop while you still can." I glared at words, trying to comprehend where they might have come from. The only person to flood into my mind was Max, the only person who, I'd felt, was really more cognizant of this place than anyone else. But his warnings had already been so pointed. Why the note? I was determined to get answers, so that evening, I returned to the building, hopeful that Max would finally tell me everything. This time, I found him in the lobby, sitting alone under the dim light, his face etched with the same wary expression I'd seen before. "You're not listening, are you?" he asked, shaking his head. "Max," I said, clutching the note in my hand, "why does she keep coming back? Who was she? Why 3:15? He looked down, heavy shoulder-laden with something I couldn't place. "Some say she was a novice at the old monastery. She was caught up in something dark, something nobody understood. When the fire got going, they say she ran to the highest place she could find, looking for a way out. But she never found one. Did she jump? I asked, almost afraid of the answer. Max hesitated, then nodded. Some think she did. Others, they say she was pushed by something, or someone. That she's still looking for whoever it was. His words settled over me like a shroud, the weight of them suffocating. Do you think that's true? He didn't say anything, but his silence was enough. I was out of the lobby and pressing my way up to the 23rd floor in less than a minute, with a growing sense of trepidation that was starting to feel like I was walking into something way over my head. Standing on the balcony that night, my mind ran through everything Max had said. I looked out over the city, feeling the cold bite of the wind, and wondered what it must have been like for her, trapped in that final, terrible moment. My watch ticked closer to 3:15, and I waited, breath held, half dreading, half expecting her to appear again. Then, as if on cue, she was there. This time closer, stumbling distance away, her figure more clear, defined. Her dark dress fluttered in the breeze, her face still shrouded in darkness. She looked at me with an intentness that ran a shiver down my spine, scarily, like she was seeing me, really seeing me. And just like the previous night, she raised her hand, reaching out. Yet something in the set of her body had changed. There was no accusation, no anger. Instead, she seemed pleading. As if she were trying to tell me something, something that had been locked away for decades. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Nothing happened for a second. She just stared at me, her hand out, and then, in less than a second, I could have sworn her mouth moved, words forming that I couldn't hear. But before I could say anything, the faintest smile crossed her face, a sad, hollow expression that fled as quickly as it appeared. Then in one smooth, silent motion she stepped off the balcony and was swallowed by the darkness below. I don't know how long I stood there staring into the empty space where she'd been. Frozen, I was caught between terror and this strange sense of understanding. She was trapped in that endless fall, in some sort of cycle where the moment of her death repeated itself over and over as she looked for something, or someone, to snap her free. I passed the remainder of the night putting together fragments of the story. If she had been looking for someone, it was possible whatever happened to her wasn't an accident. Maybe she'd been pushed, betrayed by someone close to her. But why appear now? Why reach out to me? The next day, fatigue began to set in. I hadn't had a good night's sleep for days, and the existence of that building weighed on me, weighing me down no matter what I did. I tried to go through my day as normally as possible, but it was clear to anyone who saw me that something was wrong. Even my editor, Danny, noticed it. "You okay, Evan?" he asked, eyeing me with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "You look like you've just seen a ghost." I forced a laugh, brushing it off, but deep inside, I knew he wasn't all that far from the truth. I could feel her presence still lingering, the strange silent gaze still etched in my mind. And lying awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I knew I couldn't turn back now. Whatever happened to her, whatever story was buried in that building, I had to uncover it. But the question haunted me and pressed in on the edges of my mind: was I going to turn out no different from other pieces of the building's history? The following night, at 3:15 a.m., I again stood inside that high-rise building. The time had come when I needed to know what had kept her here, reliving that same moment every night. It had grown beyond just a story now, it was something that mirrored my own, as though her tragedy was bleeding into my own life. As I stepped onto the 23rd floor balcony, the night air was cold, sharp, and biting against my skin. City lights glittered below, impersonal as the strange, invisible world up here. I leaned against the railing, half wondering whether this would be the night she'd finally explain why she was here, what she wanted. The seconds ticked by, each one drawing me deeper into that familiar tension. Then, at precisely 3:15, I felt a shift in the air, a quiet that seemed to still even the hum of the city. And just like clockwork, she appeared at the edge of the balcony, almost close enough to touch. This time she was different, her dress seeming more worn, her figure more faint, her face clearer, pallid, expressionless yet fixed in an unspeakable sadness. She stared out past me, her eyes fixed on the city below. In a moment she seemed as real as I was, solid and human, someone just blundering onto the balcony by mistake. But when she turned towards me, I knew she saw me. I opened my mouth, but no words came. Instead, she raised her hand once more, that same beckoning gesture, as if begging for something I couldn't understand. I reached out, my hand hovering in the cold space between us, when suddenly she hunched forward, falling silently into the darkness below. Instinctively, I leaned over the railing, watching her disappear into the darkness. There was no sound, no impact, just silence, as though she'd never been there at all. And then, to my horror, I realized something. I was seeing her reflection in the glass of the building opposite, yet when I looked back down at the balcony, she was standing there again. Her eyes, fixed on mine, didn't release, pleading, desperate. She wasn't just falling, she was stuck, with no way out of this infinite loop taking her right back to that moment. The next day, I couldn't get her off my mind. I performed all of my routines, however, suddenly, it just seemed like everything was distorted, as if the shades of the building began to follow me, curving the light, distorting reality. Every time I looked into a mirror, I thought I could catch her outline quiver behind me, there the one moment before I turned. I was determined to break the cycle and started afresh with the records of the city, going through every manuscript I could lay my hands on. Slowly, I found something that was not quite right, an old newspaper article from the 1930s. Its readability was no good, but it had nevertheless caught my eye. The article had described an incident of fire in the old monastery that used to stand in place of the building now looming there. It told the tale of a young novice by the name of Lillian who had been accused of theft, a grave offense in those days. She was supposed to have been punished in some sort of secretive, brutal way, though details were not specified. That night, in despair, she tried to escape up the belfry tower, but the fire had engulfed her, and nobody ever saw her again. Her fate had remained a mystery, and one spoke her name with a cautionary whisper only. I felt a strange sense of resolution as I came back into the building that night. If she was Lillian, then perhaps what she needed was for someone to acknowledge her, understand her story. Maybe that was why she continued to appear, was bound to that balcony, playing out her final moments for any who dared watch. When I went to the 23rd floor hallway, it was dark, the smell of burn heavier than before. I did not hesitate, climbing out to the balcony with a printed copy of the article in my hand and somehow offering her a fragment of her past that might give her some peace. I waited and watched for the spot where she would appear. The minutes ticked away, the silence around me growing louder until it was almost unbearable. At 3:15, finally, she appeared in that same spot as always, the form wavering slightly in the cool night air. This time, I spoke. "Lillian," I whispered, extending the article towards her, my voice trembling. "I know what happened. I know they wronged you." Her expression softened, her eyes on a quest to probe mine, and for the first time, she really saw me. Again her hand rose, and this time I extended mine to meet her, the tips of our fingers almost touching. A chill ran through me, but I didn't waver, my gaze unbroken. She mouthed the words so I could hardly catch them. "Help me," she whispered, a hint of a breeze. In that instant, I knew her pain, her fear, her endless longing to be free. Yet even as I stood, something far more disturbing came into focus. She was not alone. Shadows shifted behind her, darker figures moving just out of sight, as if they too were tied to this place, not willing to let her go. Suddenly, her face contorted and twisted into a mask of terror. The shadows thickened, closing in around her, swallowing up her form. She reached out to me once more, her fingers brushed mine, and then she was gone, leaving only the stifling weight of silence in her wake. I stumbled backward, gasping for breath, the darkness closing in around me. The weight of her final plea, that whispered, "Help me," lingered on, a harbinger that whatever haunted this building wasn't ready to let her go or me. As I turned to leave, a realization settled over me, cold and unwelcome. It had stopped being a story from which I could simply read and look on. It was about me now, or just as good as, because whatever curse it was that was binding her to this place was reaching for me, too. I barely slept that night, her last words pleading help me ringing within my head and making that feeling of my being in way over my head impossible to shake off. I could not anymore feign it as some story or mystery to be unraveled. Whatever held her there had started digging claws deep enough into me too. The next day, I read everything I could find, trying to find anything that would help me free her from this cycle she was repeating. But the more I dug deeper, I found how little I knew about her, about the building, and actually what really happened on that night of fire. That left me with one lead by evening: the basement of the building. According to old plans, the house foundations were built over remnants of the monastery. If there were answers, they would be buried there. That night, I returned to the building and quietly slipped down into the basement. It smelled of damp concrete and decaying matter, with dim lights barely showing the way down winding corridors. The farther in I went, the more the acrid smell of burnt things weighed heavily, like the substance of something tucked away, hidden. I came upon an old door, rusty and half-concealed behind storage boxes. It creaked to show a narrow flight of stairs leading down into darkness. The air was thick, almost alive, pressing in around me. I went down the stairs very slowly, each step magnifying the silence to the extent that I could hear my heartbeat echoing off the stone walls. Down below, I stepped into what seemed to be an old stone chamber. The air was cold, and the vague outline of symbols that long since faded adorned the walls. It felt old, untouched, yet something within the room felt disturbingly familiar, as though I'd stepped back into her memory, her final moments. And then I saw it, etched faintly into the wall, Lillian's name. As I reached out and touched it, the temperature plummeted. My frozen breath stood mid-air, and a soft whisper streamed right across the room, one I knew so well. "Help me." The fact was that my blood ran cold, and in that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. An unbearable silence was what surrounded me, the kind of silence that leans against you, turning your insides raw with every breath, every heartbeat. I circled around Lillian's name etched in the stone, my fingertips growing icy cold in an instant. The walls seemed to close down upon me, and with every tick of a second, the air got colder. I turned and scanned the chamber for any other clues, anything now that might speak of a way to free her. The symbols on the walls faded, intricate suggested rituals, ancient ones I could hardly dream of understanding. They were a twisted lattice of patterns, geometric shapes that pulsed with a faint life in the dim light, almost alive. That is when I saw something planted in a crevice of the wall, an old, discolored locket. Carefully, I pulled it out, the metal icy against my skin. Opening it, I found inside a small, faded picture, a young woman with eyes full of sorrow. I knew it just had to be her. "Lillian," I whispered, barely, in a tone louder than a whisper. It was as if on cue, for suddenly a cold gust of air whispered through the room and made the shadows of its walls quiver. I snapped the locket shut and tucked it in my pocket, where a strange connection to her took hold, a bridge that spanned decades. Unable to explain it, something just told me this locket had been precious to her. Maybe this was what it took to end her torment, a fragment of her past needing to be returned. I made my way back up, the weight of the locket was heavy in my pocket. The building felt all the more oppressive as I climbed, each floor colder than the previous one. By the time I reached the 23rd floor, I felt as though I had walked into another world, one that shouldn't belong to the bustling city just outside of it. I stood out on the balcony, clutching the locket tightly, the metal biting into my palm. The minutes dragged themselves along, crawling, while each increased the tension in the air to the point whereby even my own breathing seemed too loud, too intrusive. And then, just as the clock struck 3:15, she appeared. But this time, Lillian's form was more defined, more real, as if with each night she stepped deeper into this world. Her dark dress billowed behind her, and her eyes were set not on the city below, but on me. I held out the locket, willing her to grasp the meaning. Her eyes widened somewhat, and for a moment, a flicker of recognition broke through the haunted expression. "Is this yours?" I stammered. "Did they leave you here because of this?" She said nothing, but once nodded, her eyes gentling to regard the locket, her fingers brushing against mine as she took it from me. The air around us seemed to grow colder, denser, as if the very building itself was trying to hold her captive, trying to prevent this moment from unfolding. Her eyes caught mine and, for the first time, something other than mere sorrow and pain stared back at me. There was a hint of hope there, a suggestion of peace in them. But then, something changed. The shadows that had lurked at the edge of the building now stirred, swirling into a dark mass just behind her. Lillian's face twisted with horror as her hand slipped from mine and the darkness reached closer, pulling at her as if an invisible chain. "Lillian!" I shouted, reaching for her, but it was too late. Shadows wrapped themselves around her, dragging her back, the figure faded, sliding away. The last word she managed to whisper before disappearing was a desperate whisper which keeps echoing in my ears. "Thank you." I was left to myself on the balcony, with the cold air cutting through my skin. Lillian's last whisper seemed ringing in my ears, and for a second, I thought I might still feel the light touch of her fingers against mine. But she was gone, pulled back into the darkness that seemed to have lives of their own. It was as if the building had swallowed her itself and would not let her go, even after all these years. I ran desperately down the hall, praying that somehow I might see her, that she hadn't disappeared into thin air, after all. But with every step, limbs felt heavier and heavier, as though wading through a thick, smothering fog. The air smelled of charred wood and cold stone, remnants of whatever tragedy had sealed her fate here. I stopped in front of Max's desk, but the lobby was vacant, his chair pushed back like he'd left in a hurry. Maybe he'd felt it too, the sensation building. Or maybe he knew from the beginning it was going to conclude this way. I turned to go and felt something tugging at the edge of my jacket. I looked down, expecting to see a stray corner of fabric caught on the edge of the counter. But there was nothing there, only the lingering chill of the room pressing in around me. A final message, perhaps, from her. I tumbled out into the night, and after the oppressive quiet of the building, the city lights and noise jarringly assailed me. My hands still felt numb, the cold from that balcony clinging to me, as if part of her had followed me out. I found myself looking up at the 23rd floor balcony, half expecting to see her standing there, watching me. But the windows were dark, silent like any other high-rise in the city. Yet, I knew that was not right. I knew what I'd seen and what happened in that place. The days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling she was still with me, a faint shadow just beyond the reach of my peripheral vision. I tried to move on, to dive back into my work, but my brain would consistently revert to her, specifically to that desperate, haunted look in her eyes. And then, one night, just about to click off the lights and disappear under the covers, I felt it once more in that cold, silent weight in the room. I turned toward my window and, for a split second, saw her through its dim reflection, standing behind me. She was not alone. Behind her, the shadows were darker and deeper, watching and waiting. In that swift glimpse, just as suddenly, they were gone, and I stood amidst the dead light of my apartment. I knew then that she wasn't really free. The building may have let her go, but whatever had tied her there was still free, lingering 'cause it had marked me in its passing. I was more than a mere spectator in her tragedy. I'd just become a part of it. Somewhere, I knew the shadows weren't done with me yet.